The auction hall on Station Cathara 9 smelled like old metal and alien sweat, and Marcus Vell sat in the cheapest seat at the very back, where nobody would notice him. He was a human, and that already made him invisible in a place like this. The Galactic Salvage Exchange was the largest auction house in known space, a spinning ring of commerce bolted onto the side of a dead moon, where the powerful came to pick over the bones of forgotten civilizations. And Marcus had no business being here at all. He was 34 years old, born on Earth in a town called Abilene that most humans had never heard of, let alone aliens. And he ran a one-man ship repair operation out of a rented docking bay on Callaway Station 3 systems away. And he was broke in the kind of way that made his stomach hurt when he thought about it too hard. But he was here because of a rumor. 3 rows ahead of him sat delegates from the Korvathi Combine, their massive gray frames wrapped in corporate armor that cost more than everything Marcus had ever owned combined. And beside them were representatives from the Nalori Trade Consortium and the Hasari Engineering Guild, and a dozen other alien factions whose names Marcus could barely pronounce. They were here for the same reason he was, Lot 7743. The auctioneer was a tall Palathi with 6 eyes and a voice that carried like a cathedral bell, and she moved through the lots with practiced speed, selling off derelict shuttles and dead satellites and crates of unidentified alien junk to bidders who raised their paddles with bored expressions. Marcus waited, his knee bouncing under his seat, his hands clenched on his thighs. When the main display screen flickered and showed the image of Lot 7743, the entire hall went quiet in a way that Marcus felt in his chest. It was a Vathari Dominion cruiser. The image showed a ship that was broken and dark and drifting, its hull breached in 7 places, its once beautiful crystalline surfaces cracked and dead, but even in ruin, it was the most magnificent thing Marcus had ever seen. The Vathari had been an elder species, one of the oldest in the galaxy, and they had built ships that were not merely machines, but living things. Vessels grown from organic crystalline lattices that could heal and adapt and think. And their technology was so far beyond anything else in the galaxy that even now, a full century after the Vathari had mysteriously vanished, no species had ever successfully figured out how their ships worked. This particular cruiser had been designated Shalvrethis, and it had been found drifting in an asteroid belt 60 years ago, and had been sitting in a salvage yard ever since. And in all that time, every scientist and engineer from every species who had examined it had reached the same conclusion. It was dead, and it was impossible to fix. But the raw materials alone were worth a fortune. That was why the big players were here, and the bidding started high and climbed fast as the Korvathi Combine and a second Korvathi Mining Corporation fought over who would get to cut the beautiful dead ship into pieces and sell the crystal for profit. Marcus watched the numbers climb on the display and felt sick. The bidding hit 14 million galactic credits, and the first Korvathi Corporation raised their paddle. Then the second corporation raised theirs, and then something happened that nobody expected. A legal dispute. The 2 Korvathi corporations had an existing contract conflict that apparently made it illegal for either of them to outbid the other on salvage claims in this sector. A Korvathi lawyer stood up and started shouting, and the other corporation's lawyers stood up and started shouting back, and the auctioneer called for order. And in the chaos, both corporations formally withdrew their bids, pending resolution of the dispute. Buzzed with confusion, the auctioneer asked if there were any other bidders. Silence. Every other faction in the room had already done the math and decided the ship was not worth the price without the crystal harvesting infrastructure that only the Korvathi possessed. Marcus raised his hand. The auctioneer's 6 eyes all focused on him at once. "Bidder in the back," she said, her voice careful and curious. "State your offer." Marcus stood up on legs that did not feel entirely solid, and said the number that represented every single credit he had in the universe. His entire life savings, the money he had been putting away since he was 19 years old, working double shifts in the engine rooms of freight haulers. 212,000 credits, he said. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the station's ventilation system humming 3 floors above. Then the laughter started. It began with a buzzed snort from one of the Korvathi delegates and spread like a wave across the hall. Deep alien laughter and high chittering laughter, and the wet gurgling sound that passed for amusement among the Hasari. And Marcus stood there and took it, because he had expected this, and because he had learned a long time ago that being laughed at was not the worst thing that could happen to a person. The auctioneer waited for the noise to die down, and then asked if there were any other bids, and there were not, because nobody else wanted to spend even a fraction of their money on a dead ship they could not harvest. And so the gavel came down, and lot 7743 belonged to Marcus Vell. A Korvathi delegate, a massive gray-skinned male with corporate insignia etched into his tusks, leaned over as Marcus walked past and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "You have bought yourself the galaxy's most expensive coffin, mammal." Marcus did not respond. Towed to his docking bay on Callaway Station, and it took 3 days and most of his remaining pocket money to pay for the tow. And when the great dark shape of the Vathari cruiser finally settled into his bay, it filled the entire space and then some, its broken wings extending past the bay doors, so that the station authorities sent him an angry message about obstruction fees. He stood alone in the bay and looked up at it. It was enormous and broken and dark, and everyone in the galaxy said it was dead and worthless and impossible. Marcus put on his pressure suit and cycled through the nearest hull breach and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold and silent in the way that only dead ships are silent, a silence that pressed against the ears and made a person feel very small. And Marcus moved through corridors that were lined with the dull gray remnants of what had once been living crystalline walls, and he felt the crunch of dead biolattice under his boots, like walking on dried leaves. He walked for a long time through the dark. Then he stopped in what he guessed was a central corridor, and he took off his glove, which was a stupid thing to do in an unpressurized compartment. But Marcus had never been accused of being smart, and he placed his bare hand against the wall. The wall was cold, but not entirely cold. There was something faint and buried, and almost certainly imaginary, a warmth so slight that it could have been the heat of his own palm reflecting back at him, except that Marcus was an engineer, and he had touched a lot of dead metal in his life, and this was not that. This was something else. He pressed his hand harder against the wall and closed his eyes, and stood there in the dark for a long time. Then he whispered the words that would change the history of the galaxy, though he did not know it yet. "You are not dead, are you?" Marcus did not sleep for the first 4 days. He set up a cot inside the docking bay next to the ship, and he ran cables from the station's power grid through the nearest hull breach. And he hung work lights from the broken wings, so that the great dark cruiser was bathed in the ugly yellow glow of cheap human-made lamps. And then he got to work. He started by reading everything that had ever been written about Vathari biotechnology, and there was a lot of it, because scientists from every major species had spent the last 100 years poking and prodding and scanning and theorizing. And all of their papers and studies and dissertations agreed on one fundamental point. The Vathari biolattice, the living crystalline material that made up the ship's structure, was dead, and dead things could not be brought back to life. Marcus read all of it, and then he set it aside and thought about it in the way that he thought about most things, which was not the way a scientist would think about it, but the way a man who had grown up on a farm in Texas would think about it. Every alien species that had studied these ships had treated the biolattice like a machine, a piece of technology that needed to be activated or powered up or reverse engineered. and they had tried pumping energy into it, and running electrical currents through it, and bombarding it with exotic particles, and none of it had worked, because they were all asking the same question. How do we turn it on? Marcus asked a different question. How do we feed it? The idea came to him on the 5th day when he was eating a protein bar and staring at a section of dead lattice, and he noticed that the crystalline structure, under magnification, looked almost exactly like the branching pattern of dried-out coral. Coral was alive, or it had been alive, and when coral died, it left behind a skeleton, and sometimes that skeleton could be brought back if the conditions were right, if the water was clean and warm and full of the right nutrients. Marcus went to the station's supply market and bought 600 pounds of amino acid compounds and mineral supplements and a water recycling unit that was meant for agricultural habitats, and the shopkeeper looked at him like he had lost his mind, but took his money anyway. He spent the next 2 weeks building a system of tubes and pumps that ran through the ship's existing capillary network. The tiny channels in the walls and floors and ceilings that had once carried nutrients through the living vessel, the way blood vessels carry blood through a body. And most of these channels were clogged or collapsed, but Marcus cleared them one by one with patience and a set of very thin brushes and a lot of cursing. Then he mixed his nutrient solution and warmed it to exactly 37 degrees, which was human body temperature, and which he chose for no scientific reason other than it felt right. Pumped it into the ship. Nothing happened. Nothing happened for 3 more days, and Marcus sat on the floor of the central corridor and stared at the walls and wondered if he was the biggest fool in the galaxy. On the 4th day after the first feeding, Tiff showed up. Tiff was a Nellori, which meant she was about 1 meter tall, with 4 arms and enormous dark eyes, and a nervous disposition that made her look like she was always about to flee from something. And she worked as a freelance mechanic on Callaway Station, and she had heard the rumors about the crazy human who bought a dead Vathari ship, and she came to see the disaster for herself. She found Marcus on his hands and knees in a corridor, with a magnifying lens pressed against the wall. "What are you doing?" she asked from the doorway. "Looking," Marcus said. "At what?" "Come here." Tiff crept forward on her small feet and crouched beside him and looked through the lens. What she saw made all 4 of her hands go still, which for a Nellori was the equivalent of a human's jaw dropping. There was color in the lattice, just a tiny patch no bigger than a thumbnail, but where the crystalline structure had been uniformly gray and dead for over a century, there was now a faint shimmer of blue, the barest hint of life returning to something that the entire galaxy had declared impossible to revive. "That is not possible," Typh said. "And yet," Marcus said. Typh left and came back the next day with her tools, and she never officially agreed to help, but she also never left. And over the following weeks the 2 of them worked side by side in the belly of the dead ship, clearing capillary channels and adjusting nutrient mixtures, and monitoring the slow, miraculous spread of blue through the gray. The patches of living lattice grew like moss on stone, creeping outward from the places where the nutrient flow was strongest. The ship began to change in small ways that made Marcus's heart beat fast. Walls that had been cold became warm. Hairline cracks in the crystalline hull began to fill themselves in, the living lattice growing new material to seal wounds that had been open for 100 years. The air inside the ship, which had been stale and dead, began to carry a faint scent that Marcus could not identify, but that made him think of rain on warm Earth. Word got out, because word always gets out on a space station. And 3 weeks after Typh started helping, a Korvathi corporate spy docked at Callaway and came to Marcus's bay with an offer of 10 million credits for the ship, which was nearly 50 times what Marcus had paid. Marcus said no. The spy, a sleek Korvathi female in expensive corporate dress, studied him with eyes that held no warmth, and said, "You do not say no to the Korvathi Combine, human." Marcus said, "I just did." went back to work, but Typh was shaking for the rest of the day because she understood what the Korvathi were and what they did to people who refused them. And Marcus understood it too, but he had made a promise to this ship, even if the ship could not hear it, and he was not going to break it. The real breakthrough came 6 weeks later. Marcus had been mapping the ship's internal structure, and he had found a chamber at the very center of the vessel, a room shaped like the inside of a rib cage, and in the middle of this room was an object that he could only describe as a heart. It was a crystal the size of a large dog, multifaceted and dark, and connected to the ship's lattice by 1,000 thin filaments. And every scan Marcus ran told him it was completely inert. But the scans also showed that the crystal had an internal structure of extraordinary complexity, layers within layers within layers, and Marcus realized that this was not a power source in the way that aliens understood power sources, not a reactor or a battery or a fuel cell. It was an instrument. It was meant to vibrate. Marcus had served in the Earth Navy for 8 years before he became a salvage operator, and one of his postings had been on a submarine, a real old-fashioned water submarine used for deep-sea mining on Europa. And on that submarine, he had operated sonar equipment that worked by sending sound waves through water and listening to what came back. He spent 4 days building a harmonic frequency emitter out of old sonar parts and speaker components and cable and tape, and he mounted it next to the crystal heart, and then he began to tune it. He tried frequency after frequency, thousands of them, adjusting the pitch and the amplitude and the resonance pattern, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. Tiff told him to sleep, and he did not sleep. On the 3rd day of tuning, at 4 a.m. station time, Marcus hit a frequency that was low and warm, and hummed in his chest like a heartbeat, and the crystal pulsed. Just once. A single flash of blue-white light that filled the chamber and made Marcus throw his arm over his eyes. Then it pulsed again, and again, and the pulses became steady and rhythmic, and the light became constant, and the entire ship shuddered around them. A deep vibration that Marcus felt in his teeth and his bones, and Tiff grabbed his arm with all 4 hands and said something in Nilori that he did not understand, but that sounded like a prayer. The crystal heart of the Vathari ship was beating, and 3,000 light-years away, in a dozen different systems, on a dozen different stations and salvage yards and museum displays, every Vathari derelict ship that had been sitting cold and dead for 111 years, pulsed once with blue-white light, and then went dark again, like an answer, like a hello, something waking from a very long dream. The pulse was detected by monitoring stations across the galaxy within minutes, and within hours, the galactic news networks were burning with the story. And within days, Marcus Vell's name was known on 1,000 worlds, though not in the way he would have chosen. The headlines called him reckless and dangerous and foolish and human, and that last word was used the way it always was when aliens talked about the youngest spacefaring species in the galaxy, as a synonym for stupid. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session and issued a formal demand that Marcus surrender the Vathari vessel immediately for what they called study and containment, which Marcus understood to mean they would take it apart and lock the pieces in separate vaults, and spend another century writing papers about why it could not be done, while the ship died a second and final death. Marcus said no. He said no because 3 years ago, when he was just starting his salvage business, he had salvaged a derelict human freighter from a debris field, and the Hasari Engineering Guild had claimed it as their property under some obscure interstellar salvage law. And Marcus had lost that fight, and lost the ship, and nearly lost his business. And after that, he had spent 6 months studying galactic law until he found a clause buried deep in the Galactic Compact. Article 7, Section 14, Subsection C, known informally as the Human Salvage Amendment, which humanity's diplomats had fought for decades to include, which stated that any vessel lawfully purchased at a licensed auction by a citizen of a recognized species was the sovereign property of that citizen and could not be seized by any governmental or corporate body without a full tribunal hearing and the unanimous consent of all compact signatories. Getting unanimous consent from 340 species was functionally impossible, and Marcus knew it, and the council knew it, and so while the politicians argued and filed motions and made speeches about the danger of uncontrolled elder species technology, Marcus went back to work. He could not replicate Vathari technology because nobody could, and he could not fully understand it because 100 years of alien science had failed to crack it. But Marcus was not a scientist, and he was not trying to understand it. He was trying to help it. And where the ship could not help itself, he would fill in the gaps with what he had. He started with the hull. The biolattice was healing, but it was healing slowly, and there were 7 major breaches where the crystalline structure was too damaged to regrow on its own. And so Marcus did something that made Typh cover her eyes with all 4 hands. He welded human-made tritanium plating over the breaches, not as a replacement for the lattice, but as a scaffold, a framework for the living crystal to grow around and through, the way a vine grows around a trellis. And within days, biolattice was doing exactly that, threading itself through the tritanium in branching blue veins that fused alien biology with human metallurgy in a way that no one had ever imagined. Then he tackled the power systems. The crystal heart was beating, but it was weak, like the heart of someone who had been in a coma for a century, and Marcus could not make it stronger by any method he understood. So instead, he installed a human-made fusion reactor as a backup, wiring it into the ship's systems alongside the crystal core, so that the 2 power sources worked in parallel, one ancient and alive and mysterious, and one modern and mechanical and reliable. Then came the navigation problem. The ship had its own neural network, a biological brain distributed throughout the lattice that was slowly waking up along with the rest of the vessel, but it was confused and fragmented, and spoke in impulses that no human instrument could interpret. So Marcus installed a standard human AI navigation suite, a system called Aria that he had salvaged from a scrapped Earth Navy corvette, and he connected it to the ship's biological network through a series of interface cables that he designed himself using a combination of fiber optics and nutrient tubes. Aria and the ship's biobrain did not get along at first. The AI reported errors and anomalies and contradictions, and the biobrain sent surges of confused impulses that crashed Aria's systems twice. But Marcus kept rebooting and reconfiguring and adjusting until gradually, over weeks, the 2 systems began to communicate, began to learn each other's language, began to merge into something that was neither fully artificial nor fully organic. The result of all this work was a ship unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It was beautiful and ugly at the same time, a vessel of flowing crystalline curves, marked with welded tritanium patches and studded with human-made sensor arrays and antenna clusters, asymmetrical and improvised and alive in a way that no ship had been alive in over a century. Marcus called it Lot 7743 because the auction house had given it that number, and because keeping the name felt like a reminder of where they started, and because it annoyed the people who thought he should treat the ship with more reverence. 2 new crew members arrived during this period. The first was Jin Oshiro, a human woman who had served with Marcus in the Earth Navy, and who showed up at his docking bay one morning with a duffel bag and a welding rig, and said she had seen the news and figured he could use someone who knew how to shoot, because the Korvathi were definitely going to try to kill him. The second was Salvan. Salvan was a Vathari, not one of the vanished ancient Vathari, but one of their descendants, a member of the small diaspora population that had been off-world when the species disappeared 111 years ago. And he was a historian who had spent his entire life studying his people's lost civilization. and he had been disgraced by the academic community for insisting that the Vathari ships were not dead, but sleeping. And when he heard what Marcus had done, he traveled across 3 sectors to see it with his own eyes. Solvan was tall and thin, with skin that had a faint crystalline shimmer, and eyes that were deep violet. And when he stepped aboard and felt the warmth of the living walls, and saw the blue glow of the healing lattice, he stopped walking and stood very still for a long time. Then he wept. He pressed his hands against the wall and closed his eyes, and tears ran down his crystalline cheeks. And Marcus and Taif and Jin stood back and let him have this moment, because they understood that for Solvan this was not just a ship. It was proof that his people were not entirely gone. When Solvan composed himself, he told Marcus that the ship's original name, Shalvrathus, translated roughly into common tongue as the Patient Dreamer, and that it had been a scout vessel, fast and smart, and built to adapt to unknown environments, which explained why it was responding so well to Marcus's hybrid modifications. Solvan looked at the places where the biolattice was growing around and through the tritanium plating, and he said in a quiet voice that this was a new kind of life, that the ship was becoming something that had never existed before, neither fully Vathari nor fully human, but something new. And he said this with wonder and not with horror. The good times did not last. The Korvathi Combine, having failed to buy the ship and having failed to get the council to seize it, decided to take more direct action. And on a Tuesday morning, 3 Korvathi warships dropped out of hyperspace near Callaway Station and broadcast a message stating that they were authorized to confiscate a Vathari vessel as dangerous uncontrolled technology under Korvathi Corporate Security Statute 914. This was not legal, and everyone knew it was not legal, but the Korvathi had 3 warships, and Callaway Station had no military presence, and nobody was going to stop them. Marcus had about 10 minutes. He ran to the central chamber where the crystal heart pulsed with steady blue-white light, and he looked at the hybrid console he had built from human displays and Vathari neural interfaces, and he powered up the engines for the first time. The ship had never flown under his ownership. It had never flown in 111 years. The hybrid engines, fusion reactor, and crystal core, working together, spun up with a sound that was half mechanical roar and half musical chord. And the entire station shook, and Marcus grabbed the controls and said, "All right, let us see what you can do." Lot 7743 launched from the docking bay like a living thing released from a cage, fast and sudden and impossible. Through the bay doors and into open space, with an acceleration that should have turned Marcus into paste against the back wall, except that the biolattice absorbed the G-forces in some way that he did not understand and would figure out later. The 3 Korvathi warships tried to lock weapons. They were too slow. Lot 7743 crossed the system boundary and jumped to hyperspace before the Korvathi commander even finished giving the order to fire. And the last thing the Korvathi sensors recorded was a flash of blue-white light and a ship that should not exist vanishing into the dark between stars like it had never been there at all. They were fugitives now, and Marcus was fine with it. The Galactic Warrant called it unlawful activation of elder species technology, which sounded very official and serious, but which Marcus privately thought was a fancy way of saying that the powerful people of the galaxy were angry that a human had done something they could not, and they wanted their toy back. Lot 7743 flew through hyperspace with a smoothness that surprised everyone aboard. The hybrid engines humming in a harmony of human fusion power and Vathari crystal resonance. And Marcus sat in the pilot seat of the central chamber and watched the navigation display and tried to figure out where they were going, because the ship was taking them somewhere. The hybrid intelligence that had formed from the merger of the human AI and the Vathari biobrain was feeding coordinates into the navigation system. Not in words or numbers, but in feelings, a pull like gravity that Marcus felt in his gut when he sat in the command seat, and he followed it because he had come this far by trusting the ship, and he was not going to stop now. "We are being led," Solvan said from his station, where he was studying the ship's bio-neural patterns with instruments he had built himself. "The ship knows where it wants to go." "Where?" Jin asked, from the weapons console that she had cobbled together from the ship's dormant defense systems and a human targeting computer. "I do not know," Solvan said, "but it is excited, if a ship can be excited. The neural patterns are unlike anything I have seen. It is as if the ship is remembering something." Tiff said nothing, because Tiff was under the floor panels, replacing a coolant line that had burst during their escape, and her contribution to the conversation was a series of annoyed Nilori words that Marcus chose not to translate. During the 3 days of travel that followed, the ship changed. It had been changing slowly since Marcus first fed the bio-lattice, but now the changes accelerated, and they were different in kind from what had come before. The bio-lattice was no longer just healing itself, it was integrating. The tritanium plating that Marcus had welded over the hull breaches was being absorbed into the crystal. Not rejected or overgrown, but genuinely incorporated, the lattice threading through the metal at a molecular level, and creating a new material that was stronger than either component alone. And the same thing was happening inside the ship, where the human-made cables and conduits and circuits were being slowly enveloped by living crystal that did not destroy them, but enhance them. The fusion reactor was still running, but it was running in perfect synchronization with the crystal heart, the two power sources beating together like twin hearts in the same chest. And the hybrid intelligence was becoming something more. Marcus had named the human AI component Aria. Aria was not Aria anymore. The artificial intelligence had merged so deeply with the Vathari bio-brain that the boundary between them had dissolved, and what remained was a new mind that spoke in a voice that came from the walls themselves, a voice that was half the flat precision of machine logic, and half something warmer and stranger and older. Marcus named her Patience. Patience spoke in broken sentences that mixed data readouts with something that sounded almost like poetry, saying things like, "Hull integrity at 94%, and the stars taste like copper," and "fuel reserves nominal, and I remember flying when the galaxy was younger." And Marcus did not understand all of it, but he understood enough. She was scared, and she was waking up, and she was something that had never existed before. On the 3rd day, Patience led them to a nebula that was on no star chart. It was vast and dark and purple, a cloud of gas and dust that stretched across a region of space that the galactic maps labeled simply as unexplored. And when they flew into it, the sensors went wild with readings that Solvan had to translate, because they were in formats that only Vathari systems recognized. And then they saw it. Ships, thousands of ships, Vathari cruisers and frigates and transports and scouts, an entire civilization's fleet, drifting in the dark heart of the nebula, in perfect silent formation, their crystalline hulls dark and cold, their biolattices gray and still, a graveyard of dreams. Solvan made a sound that Marcus had never heard a Vathari make, a keening note that resonated in the crystal walls of their own ship, and he pressed his hands against the viewport and stared at the fleet of his ancestors with an expression of such raw grief and hope that Marcus had to look away. "They are all here," Solvan whispered. "The entire fleet, every ship that was unaccounted for. They came here. They gathered together at the center of the graveyard fleet was a station. It was enormous, a structure of interlocking crystal rings that dwarfed even the largest cruisers around it. And unlike the ships, it was not entirely dark. There were faint lights moving in its depths, blue-white sparks that drifted through its corridors like fireflies, and Patience said in her strange half-voice, "Home. This is home, I remember home." Marcus docked with the station, and they went inside, all four of them, walking through corridors of living crystal that glowed faintly at their approach, as if recognizing visitors for the first time in a century. And Solvan led the way, because he could read the glyphs on the walls, and the glyphs told a story. The story of the Vathari's last days. A plague had come, Solvan translated, a biological weapon that targeted organic neural tissue, possibly engineered, possibly natural, but devastating and untreatable, and it was killing the Vathari, every single one. One of them, and there was no cure and no escape. Except one. The Vathari biolattice was not merely a building material, it was a neural network of extraordinary complexity, capable of storing and running consciousness itself. And faced with extinction, the Vathari had made a choice that no other species had ever made. They uploaded themselves. Every Vathari, billions of them, had transferred their consciousness into their ship's bioneural networks, had become part of the living crystal, had entered a state that was not death and not life, but something in between, a sleep, a dream, a waiting. They had gathered their fleet in this nebula, and they had gone to sleep, and they had waited for someone to wake them. But not just anyone. The station's records were clear on this point, and Solvan's voice shook as he translated them. The Vathari had known that their technology would attract scavengers and conquerors and scientists who would try to crack open the ships like nuts to get at the treasure inside, and so they had designed the biolattice to resist any attempt to activate it by force, to remain dormant and dead-seeming in the face of any approach that treated the ships as objects to be used. The lattice would only respond to nurture, to care, to someone who approached not with the question of, "How do I use this?" but with the question of, "How do I help this?" For 111 years, every species in the galaxy had tried to activate the Vathari ships with power and science and force, and for 111 years, the ships had remained silent, because none of them had thought to simply feed a dying thing and keep it warm. Until a human did. Solvan looked at Marcus with his deep violet eyes full of tears, and said, "They were waiting for someone like you. They did not know it would be a human. They did not know what species would come, but they knew that someday someone would look at a broken ship and feel compassion instead of greed, and they built everything around that hope." Marcus did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But he did not have time to sit with it, because Patience suddenly spoke, in a voice that was sharp with alarm. "Ships entering the nebula, Korvathi signatures, many ships, a battle fleet." Marcus ran back to the command center, and looked at the sensors, and his stomach dropped. The Korvathi Combine had tracked them, probably by following the trail of crystal resonance that Lot 7743 left in hyperspace. And they had not sent 3 warships this time. They had sent 30. The Korvathi admiral broadcast his message on all frequencies, a flat declaration that the Vathari fleet was being claimed as Korvathi corporate property under the right of technological salvage, and that any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Marcus looked at the sensors showing 30 warships, and then he looked at the viewport showing thousands of sleeping Vathari ships, carrying billions of dreaming souls. And he looked at his crew, at Taif, who was trembling, and Jin, who was not, and Solvan, who was staring at the fleet of his ancestors with an expression beyond fear. Marcus placed his hand on the crystal core, and felt its warmth and its pulse, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the presence of minds. Not one, but millions, sleeping and dreaming and afraid. He closed his eyes, and spoke, not to Patience, and not to his crew, but to them, to the dreamers. "I know you are scared," he said, and his voice resonated through the crystal and out into the nebula, carried by the lattice network that connected every ship to every other ship. "I know you have been alone for a very long time, and I know this is not what you expected. I am not one of you. I am just a human, the youngest and smallest and least impressive species in this galaxy. And I cannot promise you that everything will be all right. He paused and opened his eyes and looked at the Korvathi fleet on the sensors. But I did not come here to use you, he said. I came here because someone had to care enough to try, and I am asking you now, if you want to wake up, and we will face this together. Silence. Then a light. A single ship in the graveyard fleet, a small scout, not unlike Lot 7743 itself, flickered with blue-white light. Then another, then 10 more, then 100, then they were all lighting up, thousands of Vathari ships, igniting like stars being born, the entire nebula filling with blue-white radiance, as a sleeping civilization opened its eyes for the first time in 111 years. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Vathari fleet was awake, but it was not ready to fight. 111 years of dormancy had left the ships weak and disoriented, their biolattices alive but fragile, their systems functional but sluggish, like a person standing up after being bedridden for years, and the billions of Vathari minds within them were confused and frightened, blinking into consciousness in a galaxy they no longer recognized. They had shields, but the shields flickered and stuttered. They had engines, but the engines could barely hold position. They had no weapons online, and even if they did, the Vathari had never been warriors. They had been explorers and scientists and poets, and the ships they had built reflected that, graceful and fast and clever, but not built to fight a war. The Korvathi fleet had 30 warships, with full weapons and shields and crews who had been trained for exactly this kind of operation, the violent seizure of valuable assets. Korvathi Admiral looked at his sensors, showing thousands of weakened ships full of helpless aliens, and he saw the greatest prize in galactic history waiting to be taken. He gave the order to fire. Marcus did not hesitate. He flew Lot 7743 directly into the gap between the Korvathi fleet and the Vathari ships. 1 vessel against 30. A hybrid ship crewed by 4 people against a corporate armada. And Jin looked at him from the weapons console, and did not ask if he was sure, because she already knew the answer. Patience calculated the odds of survival at 0.003%, and displayed them on the screen, and Marcus looked at the number and said, "Sounds about right for a human." Tiff said an Elori word that translated roughly to, "We are all going to die." And then she strapped herself into the engineering station, and started rerouting power to the shields, because if she was going to die, she was going to die doing her job. Korvathi salvo hit them broadside, and the shields held, barely. The hybrid barrier of human energy fields and Vathari crystal resonance absorbing the impact in a flash of blue-white light. And Marcus threw the ship into a roll that carried them under the second volley and behind an asteroid that Patience had identified as cover. What followed was the kind of fight that humans were built for, and that no other species in the galaxy truly understood. Marcus did not fight like an elder species commander. He did not form elegant battle lines or calculate optimal firing solutions or maneuver with mathematical precision. He fought like a human. He fought dirty. He used the asteroid field as cover, dodging between rocks that the massive Korvathi warships could not follow through, popping out to fire and then vanishing again like a rabbit in a briar patch. And Jin's improvised weapons could not destroy the Korvathi ships, but they could hurt them, scoring hits on engines and sensor arrays and weapon mounts, with the accuracy of a woman who had spent 10 years in the Earth Navy, learning exactly where to hit things to make them stop working. He used sensor ghosts, a trick he had learned in the Navy, broadcasting false signatures off the asteroids to make it look like there were multiple ships instead of one. And the Korvathi wasted volleys, shooting at rocks, while Marcus came at them from angles they did not expect. He redlined the engines until Typh was screaming at him in Nalori that the fusion reactor was going to melt, and the crystal core was vibrating so hard that the walls were humming, and he pushed harder because the ship could take it. The hybrid design was stronger than either component alone. Human endurance married to Vathari resilience. He used tactics from Earth's naval history, maneuvers designed for wooden ships on an ocean that had no business working in three-dimensional space combat, but that worked anyway. The Korvathi had never seen them and did not know how to counter them. The Crazy Ivan and the Thatch Weave, and a desperate spiraling charge straight at the Korvathi flagship that forced the admiral to break formation to avoid a collision. Solvan worked frantically at his station, translating the confused transmissions from the waking Vathari fleet and coordinating with their sluggish systems. And one by one, the Vathari ships began to bring their shields online, not fully and not strongly, but enough to form a patchwork barrier around the most vulnerable vessels. And Solvan wept as he worked, because he was speaking to his people for the first time, and he was telling them to hold on, just hold on. The crazy human was buying them time. Marcus held the line for 47 minutes. 47 minutes of impossible flying, and desperate shooting, and damage alarms, and hull breaches that the biolattice sealed almost as fast as they opened. 47 minutes during which Lot 7743 took hit after hit and kept flying because the ship was alive, and the ship was angry, and the ship was not going to let its family be taken. During those 47 minutes, Tiff had done something that Marcus did not know about until later. In the first seconds of the battle, while Marcus was making his insane charge toward the Korvathi fleet, Tiff had opened a communication channel and sent a message on every frequency she could reach, a message addressed to the Galactic Council and the Earth government and anyone else who was listening, and the message sent simply, "This is Callaway Station Mechanic Tiff, registration number N4412. We are in the unmarked nebula at coordinates following. The Korvathi Combine is attacking a civilian vessel and a newly discovered Vathari refugee fleet containing billions of living Vathari citizens. Send help immediately. Please, send help." The message traveled at the speed of hyperspace relay, and it reached the nearest Galactic Council peacekeeping fleet in 11 minutes, and the peacekeeping fleet mobilized in 9 minutes, and they traveled for 26 minutes, and they arrived at the nebula at minute 46 of the battle. 1 minute before Marcus's shields failed completely. 32 Galactic Council peacekeeping vessels dropped out of hyperspace in a formation that blocked the Korvathi fleet's firing lines, and the peacekeeping commander broadcast a single word on all frequencies: ceasefire. The Korvathi admiral, faced with the choice between a corporate acquisition and a war with the Galactic Council, chose survival, and his fleet powered down their weapons, and the battle was over. Marcus sat in his command seat and breathed. The ship was battered and burned and scarred, its beautiful hybrid hull pocked with blast marks, and its titanium patches glowing cherry red from absorbed weapons fire. But it was alive, and its crew was alive, and behind them the Vathari fleet glowed like a field of blue-white stars. In the hours that followed, the first fully awakened Vathari emerged, not physically, because their physical bodies were long gone, but as presences within their ships, voices that spoke through the crystal lattice with a clarity and depth that made even the Galactic Council peacekeepers fall silent. And the eldest of them, a mind that identified itself as Vathari High Curator Ashael, requested to address the galactic community. The address was broadcast on every channel in known space. Ashael spoke in a voice that resonated with the weight of centuries, and what she said was translated into every language in the galaxy simultaneously by the Crystal Lattice Network itself. She said that for 111 years her people had slept and waited and hoped. She said that during that time the great civilizations of the galaxy had found their ships and had looked upon them and had seen resources to be harvested puzzles to be solved, weapons to be seized, technology to be exploited. She said that one species, the youngest species, the smallest and least powerful species in the galactic community, the species that every other civilization mocked and dismissed and underestimated, had looked upon a broken Vathari ship and had seen something that needed to be cared for. She said that this was why the humans succeeded where everyone else failed. Not because humans were smarter, not because they were stronger or more advanced or more clever, because they were kinder. The galaxy heard this, and the galaxy was quiet for a long time. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. The Korvathi Combine faced sanctions so severe that 3 of its subsidiary corporations collapsed entirely, and the fleet commander who ordered the attack was arrested and tried and convicted of attempted cultural genocide, a charge that had never been brought against anyone before. The Vathari began the long, slow process of re-emerging into galactic civilization, and their first official act was to establish an embassy, and they did not build it on any elder species homeworld, or on the Galactic Council station, or on any of the prestigious core worlds that lobbied desperately for the honor. They built it on Earth, in a town called Abilene, Texas, because the human who saved them had once called it home, and because the Vathari wanted everyone to remember where kindness comes from, not from great capitals and centers of power, but from small places where people learn to take care of things. Marcus was offered wealth beyond counting, titles from a dozen species, command of fleets, a seat on the Galactic Council, and 100 other honors that would have made him the most powerful human in history. He turned them all down. He took the reward money, just enough to pay off his debts and buy his docking bay outright, instead of renting it. And he went back to Callaway Station, and he took down his old sign and put up a new one that read, "Vel and crew, we fix things." Tiff stayed because she had found a place where her anxiety made sense, where there was always something to worry about and always something to fix. Jin stayed because Marcus was the only commanding officer she had ever met who was worth following, and because someone had to keep these idiots alive. Solvan stayed because the ship was his people, and his people were everywhere now, waking up across the galaxy, and he wanted to be where it started, on the ship that dreamed first. Patience stayed because she was the ship, and the ship was her, the first new form of life created in the galaxy in 10,000 years, part human and part Vathari, and entirely herself. And she had chosen her crew, and she was not letting them go. On a quiet evening, station time, Marcus sat in the pilot seat of Lot 7743, with his feet up, on the console, and a cup of coffee in his hand. And Tiff was arguing with Jin about whether a hull panel should be replaced or patched. And Solvan was sitting in the corridor, reading ancient Vathari poetry out loud in a language that made the walls glow brighter. And Patience was humming along in a harmony that vibrated gently through the floor. The communication console chimed. Marcus looked at it. A message from a salvage broker 3 systems away. A notice about a derelict vessel of unknown origin found drifting near a gas giant. Species of manufacture unidentified. All scans inconclusive. No interested buyers. Another broken thing that the galaxy had given up on. Marcus set down his coffee and smiled and leaned forward in his seat. Let us go. The ship leaped into the dark, alive and eager, carrying its crew toward the next impossible thing. And behind them, the stars burned steady and bright, in a galaxy that was just a little bit kinder than it had been before.